In terms of the smaller picture that we're coming from and that we're trying to broaden the discussion from is that the community of the ethics and compliance world has been very focused on this idea: should we have a seat at the table? Who do we report to? We feel sort of neglected and sometimes downtrodden because we're sort of left in a little corner somewhere, and we don't really have access, resources, budget, etc., that justifies the kinds of risks and activities that we're supposed to engage in for our companies. So there's this sort of debate: who do we report to? What are our resources? Do we get to report to the board? Do we have a seat at the table with the executive team? And so this debate has been going on for a while. And the bottom line is that we could all say, sure, we need a seat at the table, but especially given the audience that we have in today's webcast, a lot of people could be asking for a seat at the table. Almost every title I mentioned earlier. So how do you discern who deserves a seat at the table and who not, and what function does not, and so on? So this has led us to think of a slightly different way of thinking about this. We don't really want to turn the world upside down, but we really want to ask the question a little bit differently. And that's where we're coming up with this idea of a completely different role, which any one of the people who is now currently filling, the ethics and compliance, or the sustainability, or the human resources, or even the finance, people coming from those backgrounds could end up in the role that we're talking about. So it's not closed to anyone. I think what we need to understand is, where is this role going? Who should fill it? Where does it fit in the overall pantheon? We're not saying that we're going to end up 100 years from now with something as upside down and out of whack as Planet of the Apes, obviously. So this is a little humor courtesy of Jack, but I think that it's important to note that we're not trying to reinvent the world or create some other wasteful or useless form of leadership and functional organization. So with that said, I'm going to hand this over now to Jack, who is going to raise a few questions that we think are important questions that we need to ask ourselves in our various roles and in terms of where this role is going.
Thank you, Andrea, and I appreciate joining all of the participants. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. We've posed a number of questions here that in the last several years have really served as a marker on the evolution of an ethics and compliance program. You can read them. I'm not going to go through them all. But importantly, does a chief ethics officer have direct access to the CEO? Do they report to the board or a member of the board? Are they part of the executive team, aware of the strategic goals of the company? Do they have knowledge of company crisis risk management and compliance concerns? As we looked at these questions from the lens of the ethics officer, we realized these questions can also serve as markers for multiple functions, and all you have to do is extract the chief ethics officer title and put in another one. And it would be an interesting analysis on how a company or organization looks at risk mitigation and the men and women responsible therefore. If you advance the slide, Andrea, that led us to think about how this role, the chief ethics officer, might morph into something perhaps more meaningful, perhaps more tangible, maybe even more practical on a month-in, month-out, year-in, year-out basis. So we began to ask ourselves, could a chief risk and reputation officer manage multiple corporate governance functions, including ethics? That role is very different than a strict ethics and compliance officer role, obviously. But it would be important for that role to be accountable to the senior managers of that organization, the CEO and or the board, and potentially bring a different perspective to value creation. So what we wanted to do was, again, turn that ethics and compliance paradigm on its head, apply it to multiple corporate governance functions, and think through how maybe we build that better mousetrap and think about doing our jobs better for our shareholders and other stakeholders in our organizations. Andrea?
I think one of the things that we need to sort of understand is sort of the bigger picture of where we fit in and what is going on. And I think the larger context that is driving us to thinking this way is that the world has become way more global in the sense of interconnected, in the sense that communications, social networking technology has allowed us and our information to become instantaneous. For our colleagues and various parts of our companies to be interconnected much more than they used to be. And it has also added a whole series of new risks that are emerging daily. If you just take the role of the General Counsel over the last few years, it has become a way more complex, difficult role with the growth of regulatory changes, not just in the United States, but in the EU, in other parts of the world. If you take, for example, just the one issue, which is a huge issue of anti-corruption, and the sea change that has occurred over the last 10 to 15 years, especially in the last 5 years, on anti-corruption enforcement by governments, including the US at the forefront, but certainly the other 39 countries that now have FCPA-like laws under the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. So you have this high complexity of risks that exist, the instantaneousness of the risks, and you have several roles within the company that basically have been dealing with these risks, maybe in a siloed way, maybe in a way that has not been as efficient as possible. I think just human nature creates sort of an incentive for people to become siloed, to be protective of their own areas of responsibility, to not necessarily talk with their neighbors within their own companies about similar issues. So you have sort of this pantheon of roles that have evolved. You have the General Counsel, you have the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, you have the board, the CEO, and then you have a whole bunch of others that are dealing with risk issues every day. So there's that level of complexity, and then there's also the level of complexity that exists in terms of the pressure points, the stakeholders, the various sort of pressures and potential stakeholders that have skin in the game in terms of your company. The regulators are myriad. They can be local, state, province, national, federal level. They can be of all kinds of types depending on your industry. If you're in a highly regulated industry, you have huge layers of compliance to deal with. Even if you're not in a highly regulated industry, you still have to think about the various risks that have to do with cyber issues, with fraud, with discrimination, harassment, diversity issues. Depending on your geographical footprint, you have all the different issues that you have to deal with. So while the world is becoming more globalized, it is also becoming much more complex. And so one of the issues here is within the context of a company, how does a company deal with this increasing amount of complexity, layers of regulation and compliance, also your code of conduct and your standards of behavior that are part of your value system and your company strategy and mission? How do you pull all that together and still make sense of it and still have a preventative approach to dealing with these issues, understanding what they are, mitigating them, and understanding the ones that are coming along? So with all this complexity and with sort of the division of labor that occurs within most organizations, sometimes these risks are not properly addressed. Very frequently they're not properly addressed because they exist in silos within the organization. So the idea of this Chief Risk and Reputation Officer is sort of an umbrella person or office that helps understand, just not only at the executive level but also at the board level, helps to glean, understand, describe, explain, and resolve the myriad issues that exist out there. So again, this is sort of a context slide to help us understand the difficulties and the complexity that exists for most companies.